The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Frances Sherwood, the author of Vindication, a novel about the life and times of Mary Wollstonecraft, published by Penguin. I'm Steve Benson. Well, Frances, you've done a wonderful job of creating that marvelous stew of life at the end of the 18th century. And of course, Mary Wollstonecraft is one of the most remarkable women of that time, a feminist, author, traveler, and mother of Mary Godwin Shelley, who later wrote Frankenstein.
Well, I'm glad you like my book.
Well, let's take us back to that period. And what fascinates me about your book is the fact that it's about the 18th century, but it's really a book about our time as well.
Yes, I had to make a decision when I wrote it about the sensibility, and I decided to use 20th century American English and also to infuse it with our sensibility. And there are many things in it that are reminiscent of our time and of the difficulties of our time. I've been quoted as saying that every age is an age of brutality, and I do depict an 18th century that's very grungy, very difficult, very brutal, and I think that to be the case also of the 20th century.
Well, you capture that sense of the smells and the texture of life.
Well, that's exactly what fascinated me about the period, and that's what helped to determine that I write a novel and not a biography. I found myself interested in the food, in the plumbing or lack of, in the clothing, in the street songs, in the toys, in the furniture, things that common people were engaged in, as well as the aristocracy. So I was very taken by all of that and intent on giving a rather complete picture of the time in my book.
Well, now you teach creative writing and journalism at the University of Indiana. You've written a number of short stories, but you started out to write a biography.
Right, but I read several very good biographies, but one thing that was consistent with the biographers was that they could not make heads nor tails of the discrepancy between Mary Wollstonecraft's chaotic and passionate personal life and the calm rationality of her prose and rhetoric. And I immediately understood in a very visceral way how smart people can do dumb things, how one can have a few ideas in one's head and still be passionately involved with another human being. And also, as I said, I was interested in the minutia of daily life, and I thought that the only way to approach the truth of the time, the place, and Mary Wollstonecraft was to write a novel.
She lived from 1759 to 1797, so her life really spans that incredible period, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Age of Reason, when life is chaotic and brutal, and some of the scenes in there are so arresting. There's a description of the hanging of a 12-year-old boy that still gives me nightmares.
Well, this is, of course, the liberty that I took as a fiction writer. We do not have any documentary evidence that Mary Wollstonecraft ever attended a hanging. But when I began to read about the period, one of the things that I did read was accounts of hangings, wonderful accounts of highwaymen having roses from ladies being thrown into their cart as they were taken, snaked up through Tyburn Hill to the top of the hill to Tyburn Tree, which is where they were hanged. And I thought, my God, I have to have a hanging in this book. Ditto Bedlam. We certainly don't have any evidence that Mary Wollstonecraft was ever put into Bedlam, which is a sort of euphemistic term for, psychiatric hospital is a euphemism for what Bedlam really was. And of course, now we have that term in our vocabulary. And she, of course, we don't think that she was ever in Bedlam, but I thought, oh, I have to have Bedlam in my book. So how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to put her in it. And so this is sort of the difference that you have between writing nonfiction and fiction, and what I felt I could do.
Well, your own life has been almost as complex, perhaps as chaotic as Mary Wollstonecraft's, Frances.
Yeah. Yeah, and here I am today alive. Sure. She was a great survivor. I mean, she did die at much younger than I am now. She died at 38 in childbirth, which women died of by the droves in her time. But yes, I could make a definite identification with her, and that's one of the things I liked about her. She was very moody. She was very difficult. She had a great sense of humor, very hearty. She was a working class person. She was kind of a hack. She worked for a living writing, and that's my kind of girl.
And you've done that. You grew up, your father was a radical, died, committed suicide when you were a very young girl, and you had to make your living as a waitress as well as writing.
And not just a waitress, but other things, yeah. Sure, yeah.
And back to Mary Wollstonecraft, again, who is a young woman, comes from an incredibly abusing, really an appalling childhood, and yet a person who has to make her way in the world.
Well, I think one of her, I think it's a case of being able to make your weakness a strength, and I think that she was able to make the connection of her abysmal childhood, the connection between her abysmal childhood and the suffering of other human beings in general, which made her, and then reading the ideas of the Enlightenment, the rhetoric that was coming out of the Revolution, reading Rousseau, reading Voltaire, and then jumping to the case of the oppression of women. And she, of course, was an oppressed woman, but she refused to be an oppressed woman. And I think that life intellectual connection in her is very interesting, and that's the kind of person that I am interested in.
Well, even in the best of families in the 18th century, women were considered chattel.
Sure enough, and one of Mary's problems was that her father spent her dowry. So, what was she going to do? No one would marry her, and what were the professions available to her? Well, she had all the professions available to her, but she did everything that was available to her, but that wasn't a lot, a seamstress, school teacher, governess, lady's companion, and then she was a journalist. Now, there were women at the time writing sort of potboiler novels, and I personally think that they're responsible for that genre, for the novel form, though of course Richardson, the man, gets the credit for that. And poor women, of course, were doing all the things that poor women have always done. The carting, the very menial kinds of jobs. But middle class and aristocratic women were relegated really to the home, to the household, to the within four walls.
And if they had no means of their own, then they became things like governesses and
right.
ladies' companions.
Right. Well, in my book, and some became prostitutes. Oddly enough, a lot of the prostitutes,
courtisans, they were better.
If they were lucky,
women, yeah.
If they were lucky courtesans, but a lot of the women of the street were not, your very, very poor women, but daughters of families that could not afford dowries and wanted to live. Now, these women did want to live, and Mary does talk about that in her work. There was a case during her, which in a newspaper during her time, which I quote in a book, of two rather genteel sisters dying of starvation in their home because they were not married. Now, of course, you could get married if you're lucky, if you had a dowry, but then you might die of childbirth. So things were not, bright and airy at all.
Well, and Mary, in your book, too, even though she's a very intellectual, a thinking person, she's attracted, or at least drawn to, very childish, abusive men.
Just like good old Dad. Sure. And her sister, one of her sisters as well, married a man like that. And I think we've now sort of discovered that pattern in our literature, in our sort of pop psychological literature. There are tons of books about that, codependency and all of that sort of thing. So, yes, indeedy. Too bad. What can I say?
Well, back to the parallels with modern times. While she's doing these jobs, she's also writing. And like many women, also men of today, they write in coffee shops. She wrote in tea shops.
Right. The coffee shops were for men, and the tea shops were for women. And even though she had these agonies over her love affairs, and she saved her letters, and she published her letters. So despite all her passion, there's that survival instinct and there's that rationality. Well, good gracious, I'm a writer. I better make some copy. She didn't have a Xerox machine, didn't have a fax machine, but she made copies of the letters that she sent to her lovers saying, please don't leave me. In fact, her best writing, in terms of the writing per se, is considered her letters, the letters that she wrote to Gilbert Imlay from Scandinavia.
Well, now, Mary, and scattered throughout your book, Frances, Mary writes letters. You interweave them with your own plot.
Yes, I do quote from some of her letters. Actually, though, a lot of the letters, I would say 90% of the letters that you see as letters I wrote.
There is one letter that is really extraordinary. It's one of those beautiful letters, and it also brings in a recipe for beetroot pancakes. I wonder if you've ever tried to make those pancakes.
No, I haven't. I have an 18th century cookbook, though, and it's one of my I have 2 shelves in my bookcase that are 18th century books that I used. And no, I haven't tried to replicate any of those recipes. I haven't had time.
Can you find that letter and read that to us?
Okay.
This is a letter, it begins one of the opening chapters, and it's a rather longish letter that she wrote, and I'm not sure if she wrote it to, was it one of her sisters?
Yes. Okay. Now this letter, that actually Frances Sherwood wrote this letter, though the recipe is from an 18th century cookbook. It's dated July 14th, 1788. Dear Everina, Dr. Samuel Johnson, when he was alive, had his dinner with his group in his narrow, modest house right off Fleet Street. He had the actor Garrick and that officious fool Boswell, who had gonorrhea several times. That man would not leave well enough alone. Edmund Burke, that vacillating hypocrite, and Sir Joshua Reynolds, the portrait painter, whom Blake hates with a weary and enduring passion, filled out their table. Our table, our artists, are Blake, Fuseli, Opie. Over there, they were the aristocrats, the bluestockings. We labor in the vineyard. The food for these literary dinners can be quite exotic if one can afford. Sea turtles from India and pickled mangoes from India, ketchups from China and Malaya. Not to mention cheddar and Gloucester cheese right from England. People eat a great deal here in London. A regular dinner could be roast beef, roast pork, chicken, veal and ham pies, fish, tarts, cheese, puddings, and fruits. For our dinners, Mrs. Mason comes in early Thursday morning, a little past daylight. Puddings are her forte, boiled and baked, rice or oatmeal, custard. Sweet baked puddings can be done with curds, fruits, and almonds. She can do puff pastry crusts for her puddings and uses carrots, spinach. Mrs. Mason also fancies strawberry fritters and gooseberries, celery. Our dinner may also have beetroot pancakes, described by Elizabeth Raffle in her The Experienced English Housekeeper as, quote, a pretty corner dish for dinner or supper, end quote. The recipe is as follows: 6 ounces peeled cooked beetroot, 2 tablespoons brandy, 3 tablespoons double cream, 4 egg yolks, 2 tablespoons plain flour, 1 tablespoon castor sugar, 1 teaspoon grated nutmeg, clarified butter. Mash the beetroot as finely as possible and mix with the other ingredients. Heat a shallow layer of clarified butter in a frying pan. Drop the beetroot mixture from the point of the tablespoon into the butter and shake the pan to flatten if necessary. Turn down the heat as these burn very easily. Turn the pancakes over. They will cook quickly. Wipe out the pan if necessary between batches. These unusual, delicate pancakes are good hot or cold. Garnish with green sweetmeats, preserved apricots, or green sprigs of myrtle.
Well, it's no wonder that a lot of people had the gout in the 18th century.
Right.
In that letter, of course, you set the scene for these incredible Thursday nights, the salons that Mary was a part of. Tell us, well, first of all, a little bit about the publisher Joseph Johnson that she stayed with, and then being introduced to that wonderful hothouse crowd of Fuseli the painter and William Blake, Tom Paine?
They were, Joseph Johnson was a publisher. He was actually her mentor. He took her in when she lost her job as a governess. She lived with him and she helped him edit the Analytical Review. Now, in my book, we have no evidence of any real Thursday night dinners, but I thought, you know, how am I going to get all these guys together? He also published them, and I wanted to have scenes in which they were all sort of talking about their ideas, and Mary is sort of vying with them. And she, of course, has to shout to be heard. And she does shout, and she is heard, and they do support her. But we have William Blake as a dinner guest with all of his visions and all of his sort of mystical sexuality. We have Henry Fuseli, who became one of Mary's, well, unrequited lovers, or she loved him, he didn't love her. But in my book, I have it sort of as if he loved her for a while. And we have John Opie, the portrait painter. We have gee whiz. We have Joseph Johnson, who, of course, was the publisher and sort of the center of this crowd. It's different guests dropped in at different times. And the conversation was always, of course, in my book, but also in the 18th century was an age of journalism, an age of wonderful conversation. In fact, there's the saying, pass the port in the pot. And the conversation was so rich, so, essential to hear every single word, that people did not vacate the room when they had calls of nature, because they might miss one word. And so they passed the port and the pot.
And also at that time, people would memorize lines or bon mots that they wanted to drop during the meals. Right.
But great fun, and too bad. I mean, I feel that we've lost the art of conversation here and now.
One of the delightful sections is where you talk about Mary's writing and the fact that she writes things and then puts them into her hat box. Tell us a little bit about that. Was that an actual practice of hers?
Not that I know of.
This is another Frances Sherwood invention.
Right.
But she did write bits and snippets that she said.
Right. I have a hat box. I love hat boxes. This is, like, oh, you're writing a book. Let me put in everything I want, And my friends were saying, am I in the book? Am I in the book? And in fact, they are in the book, too, in various ways. But so I had a hat box, and so I decided, well, how is she going to write Vindication of the Rights of Woman? Well, she's going to write bits and parts of it because she's working as an editor, reviewing things. And like myself, she didn't have all the time in the world. And so she did notes and sort of notes to herself about the book, and then she would put them in her hat, and I had them put in a hat box. Let me locate this.
Yes, there are a number of sections.
Yes. Right, here they are. And here I'm going to read a couple of little snippets that went into. I have her put in her hat box. Really, my hat box. Women might certainly study the art, but actually what I have her put in her hat box, these are actual quotes from Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Women might certainly study the art of healing and be physicians as well as nurses. They might also study politics and settle their benevolence on the broadest basis. Business of various kinds they might likewise pursue, if they were educated in a more orderly manner, which might save many from common and legal prostitution. And I think I just mentioned to you who the prostitutes are. So that is an actual quote from Vindication of the Rights of Women.
But then she's really referring to marriage as legal prostitution.
Yes, she is. She is, and you can see, you can see it as a very much an economic and non-sentimental attachment, and really up into the 19th century, that was the case. Here's another one. My own sex, I hope, will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. I earnestly wish to point out in what true dignity and human happiness consists.
In one of her conversations, she talks about in asking her friend, why am I two separate people? And it seems to me this is something that comes across very strongly in the book. that Mary was this thinking person. She wrote a book on raising children, but she also almost killed her own child.
She didn't almost kill her own child. I have her almost kill her own child. She did one of the things I didn't put in the book is that she adopted a child which she abandoned. Yes, she had contradictions. Yes, she was not the greatest mother in the world. She had the frustrations of trying to raise a child and earn a living and be an intellectual and function in the world. And I think, you know, when you said early on that there were many things about the 18th century that I have that reflect on the 20th century, I still don't think that we have adequate child care for women who work outside of the home. And that people that want to live a complete life, and which includes motherhood, parenthood, have great frustrations, great frustrations.
She also thought that women and girls should exercise because men were admired for their strength, and she wanted girls and women to exercise to see if they could reach the prowess of men.
That's why I take aerobics.
1792, she publishes The Vindication of Women, and it creates a tremendous storm. I think it's Horace Walpole that says she's a hyena in petticoats. And the blue-stocking women who one would have expected would come to her defense are also put off by this book. Why?
Well, and maybe we should give people a little background about the blue-stocking women. These were the sort of literati, the aristocratic women who were in fact supported by their husbands, who would meet in salons and discuss ideas and did have some education. But of course they were backed by their husband's income. Now Mary was a working class person. She wrote for a living. And if she said something about marriage being legalized prostitution, where did that put them? Who were they selling out to? And they could very much afford their tastes and their attentions and so forth. So it seems quite automatic that they would attack her. Income-wise, they were really separated. The circumstances of their life were so much different, and here she was talking about the ordinary woman, the middle-class woman, and of course they were cultivating the arts as a sort of luxury item.
Of course, she's been vindicated now in our time, but at the time were there women and perhaps men who agreed with her?
Yes, there certainly were. And Abigail Adams, our own Abigail Adams was one of them. Oddly enough, even her husband, the president. And in fact, they read it aloud to each other from Vindication of the Rights of Women.
And she writes them, "Don't forget the ladies."
Yes, and Abigail says, "Don't forget the ladies." Some Americans, her own circle of intellectuals, and there were people, I mean, she was a bestseller. And right after Vindication of Rights came out, a couple of months later, the second edition had to come out. So we do have somebody here who was striking a note that was ready to be heard by some people. But unfortunately, what happened is that after her death, her husband, well-meaning as he was, wrote a memoir about her in which he detailed aspects of her personal life which were found to be scandalous, and so she was buried. Her work was buried for quite a long time, a good 100 years.
William Godwin, it was almost a quiet phase in her life. I mean, she'd lived this tumultuous life traveling in France and Sweden. I loved your description of Sweden, a harsh, unforgiving fairy tale.
You know, I've never been to Sweden, and I didn't have a Sweden chapter, and my editor said, "You have to have a Sweden chapter." So, you know, I was really scratching my head and using the Encyclopedia Britannica, and because I ran out of money, I couldn't go to Sweden. I did go to France, and I did go everywhere else in the book, but right. Yeah, Godwin was a great sort of savior and release for her. I mean, here you have somebody that has a man leave her. I mean, of all the stereotypical things for an actress, right after she has his baby, you have her go through 2 suicide attempts, and this man respected her work, was also a fellow intellectual, a philosopher, and it is just so very sad that she died giving birth to their child.
Yes, and which was such a common fate of of women in the 18th century.
Well, yes, it was, but interestingly enough, she had a first child with a midwife in France, and that went extremely well, and I almost make it like a birthday party in my book. And in the second childbirth, they called in the expert. The midwives were being replaced by men who went to the Royal College of Surgeons, and women stopped having children at home and started to have them in the lying-in hospitals, and they were infected by the droves with childbed fever, which is simply a matter of not washing your hands. And so the afterbirth did not come out, and the physician was summoned, and here they were, this modern couple, right? And they summoned the physician, no midwife for Mary, for Mary Wollstonecraft. Now that she's written all this stuff, and we're this great couple, and he reached in and manually brought out the afterbirth and infected her.
Of course, without washing his hands.
Without washing his hands.
Yeah. And of course, this is this extraordinary child, Mary Godwin, who becomes Shelley, and who later on writes Frankenstein.
Right. Right, and the last chapter in my book, and this is actually true, Percy Shelley did court her on her mother's grave, and the last words of the book is, "Mother, may I?"
Could you close just by reading that one extraordinary thing about the difficulty of trying to go back?
Oh, okay. This is relates to disappointment and love. Okay. At the end of an affair, lovers gather up things, give back trinkets, books and little mementos, ribbons and slips of paper, feathers and leaves, as if reclaiming each object is a way of coming to grips, an effort to once again place oneself in the world. This is the way I was before you, we seem to say, and I can go back to that and still exist.
Wonderful. Your next project now quite a bit different. You move ahead quite a ways in time.
Yes, as my short stories, as my novel is different from my short stories, this new novel is going to be very American in feel, tone, about the 1950s. And it's a woman is going to be a central character, but not a historic figure.
Now, it seems to me that the 50s would be just about your coming-of-age time.
Right. I graduated from high school in 1958, and let me tell you, it was rough.
As with the book on Mary Wollstonecraft, presumably you're going to be bringing your current life and inserting that back into the 1950s.
Current and not so current. Yeah, I'm going to, it's not going to be autobiographical, but I'm going to use certain things that I observed growing up in the 50s, the great conformity, the squelching of individuality, and how dreadful it was, how I felt in the 50s, growing up girl in the 50s. Like, I was not engaged by the time I graduated from high school, and I was in utter panic.
Frances, thank you very much for joining us. And let me announce once again that Frances Sherwood is the author of Vindication, just published by Penguin Press, and please tune in again.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.